Sorry, we've received apologies from Councillors Dupre, Maguire and Sanderson, and we're pleased to welcome Councillors Coots, Bywater and Ferguson, substituting for them. Thank you.
Thank you for that. Does any member need to make a disclosable pecuniary or non-statutory disclosable interest? Councillor Bywater.
Yeah, thank you, Chairman. Just for information, I'm the Huntingdon District Council representative on the Health and Wellbeing Board, which relates to agenda item 3.
Thank you for that. Any other declarations of interest? That being the case, we move on to the next item, which is minutes of the meetings held on February the 25th, 2022. Members, you are asked to approve these minutes. Do I have any proposer? Councillor Ferguson proposing. Seconder? Councillor Boulat. Thank you. All in favour? Any against? And any abstentions? One abstention. 2 abstentions. You weren't there, that's quite right. Okay, thank you very much. So if you just give me a second while I sign 2 sets of minutes. Thank you, members. We move on now to agenda item number 3, which is the establishment of a joint Cambridgeshire and Peterborough Health and Wellbeing Board. So I am very pleased to welcome the Director of Public Health to present the report. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Chair. And I'd just like to acknowledge the contribution that my colleague who's joined by Zoom, Kate Parker, has made to the production of the papers that you have before you for consideration. So the origins of the Health and Wellbeing Board lie in the 2012 Health and Social Care Act. And since the Act was passed, we've had 2 Health and Wellbeing Boards in operation, one for Peterborough and one for Cambridgeshire. In the light of the more recent integration white paper, we have reconsidered how we want to move forward. That paper establishes the integrated care system comprised of an integrated care board and integrated care partnerships. Now, you could be easily forgiven for getting lost in the acronyms. Do ask any questions if you feel the need to. In the light of those changes, we organised a couple of development days with wide involvement, including health service colleagues, current members of the Health and Wellbeing Board, districts, as well as combined authority representation. And at those development days, we considered whether we wanted to work together. So that's the ICPs and the Health and Wellbeing Boards and the 2 Cambridgeshire and Peterborough Health and Wellbeing Boards. And if so, how did we want to work together and on what? Given that there is considerable overlap in the membership that's required for ICPs as well as health and wellbeing boards, and the fact that there is also considerable overlap in the functions required of health and wellbeing boards and integrated care partnerships, we felt that it was at those development days that it was in all of our interests to work collaboratively to avoid the need for parallel meetings with essentially the same members, to pool our collective resources to really push forward on the things that matter to us all, and to prevent the potential of parallel and potentially divergent strategies emerging. So at the first development day, we did in fact agree that we wanted to, all of us, the Peterborough Health and Wellbeing Board, the Cambridgeshire Health and Wellbeing Board, and the ICPs to work together on a number of things that we found to be collectively of value and importance to us. So that was the first conclusion from the development day. And the second was that we wanted to work as closely as possible and ideally to have a single committee to take forward this work. However, there are statutory functions that health and wellbeing boards and ICPs must deliver, and they are required statutorily to meet independently. So the conclusion that we have reached is that the the Health and Wellbeing Boards, the combined Peterborough and Cambridgeshire Health and Wellbeing Board, alongside the ICP, would meet as a committee in common. And we do, in fact, have the same membership. And if there are matters that need to be dealt with separately, they will be dealt with in a Part B of both meetings. So the paper before you sets out how the Peterborough and Cambridgeshire elements of the Health and Wellbeing Board will meet together and the membership of those. I will just go through the things that we agreed were important to us and that we're going to work together as background for you. We agreed to 3 overarching goals, and they were to improve healthy life expectancy, to reduce inequalities in premature mortality, and to improve outcomes for children. And they will be delivered through 4 sub-priorities, and they are environments that promote healthy living, a good start and a good end to education, improving mental health through a focus on prevention and early intervention, and addressing poverty through housing and employment. We did present the papers that are before you to the Peterborough Cabinet Policy Forum yesterday, and they did accept all of the recommendations before them, with the exception of an additional member that they wanted to put forward, and that is the member for children's, I'm just getting the exact title, unless you've got it, Kate, to hand.
It's the Cabinet member for children's and schools, education and university settings.
Thank you, Kate. So that's the additional recommendation that we'd like to add to the papers that are before you. Thank you. I'm happy to take any questions.
Thank you for that. So that is an addition of Peterborough City Council Cabinet Member for Children's Schools and Education Settings, I think you said, which would be put on the bottom of the list on page 7 of 70. Yep. Okay, thank you. Members, questions? Councillor Bywater.
Thank you very much, Chair. Firstly, Jyoti, I want to thank you and the team for all the hard work that's been put into this. And maybe just a question I've got in relation to Peter's approach. Are we going to do the same here in Cambridgeshire? Maybe our chairman of the CYP committee, maybe. And the point I want to just raise in relation to, I've spoken about it before, about the district council representatives. Are we going to have a councillor from each district council on the Health and Wellbeing Board?
So the answer to the first question, partly the reason they've put forward an additional member is to match the 2 members that are on the Cambridgeshire side. They would have only 1 and Cambridgeshire would have 2. So that's part of the reason why they've put forward the additional member that they have. What we're proposing is that there's a single representative and probably an officer representative for the districts. And that's in recognition of the fact that previously there have been members on the board, but there hasn't been the level of engagement that's needed with the other districts to ensure that they are all properly represented. So instead, there's been a change to that, to have a single officer representative for the districts who will be required to liaise with all of the other districts and present a collective view.
Just to clarify then, because it says on page 7, above the list of local authority members, there is also a statutory requirement for at least 1 local authority councillor and at least 1 representative on the ICS NHS board to be a member of the Health and Wellbeing Board.
Kate, do you want to come in? I think that they've got a member, haven't they, on theirs?
Yes, sorry, to add to, so whilst we have got membership relatively in common with the ICP, they are also going to do the same and have a district council representative on theirs that will be different from the Health and Wellbeing Board representative. So when we meet as a committee in common, you will actually have 2 district representatives there. and that's because their focus is going to be slightly different from ours, and we thought that that was the better way of managing actually and ensuring that we're getting the district representation increased on the two partnership boards.
Thank you for that. Councillor Gough.
Just one question on the Appendix A in terms of the standing orders. In terms of the co-option arrangements under paragraph 1, is it the intent that the decision-making process around co-option will be followed in accordance with paragraph 6?
Yes, if you'd like to answer that.
I'm asking Kate if she knows the answer to that. Sorry.
Kate, you're on mute.
I was trying to unmute whilst reading the documents, so apologies. So was it section 6 that you were?
Sorry, whether the co-option process, which is in paragraph 1,
yeah,
whether the decision making around that would follow the guidance in section 6, paragraph 6 on decision making.
Okay. Decision making. Yes, yeah, that's okay. How, yeah.
Okay, so my suggestion, Chair, is that for the avoidance of doubt, that maybe that be made clear in the standing orders that is the process to be followed.
Thank you, Kate. Would you be able to make that change for consideration by full council when the moment comes?
Yes, of course.
Thank you. Any other questions? No. We are asked to recommend to full council that the terms of reference set out in Appendix A be approved for inclusion in the Constitution. And of course, with the small addition of the Peterborough City Council cabinet member lead as suggested. Do I have a proposer? Councillor Gough, a seconder, Councillor Boulat, all in favour? Any against? One against. Any abstentions? Okay, thank you very much. Thank you, Director, very much indeed for that. Thank you, Kate, much appreciated. So we move on to agenda item 4, which is contract procedure rules. We are asked to recommend to full council the amended contract procedure rules set out in Appendix 1 be approved for inclusion in the Constitution. And we welcome Head of Procurement, Claire Ellis, to present the report. Thank you.
Thank you. Good afternoon. Just a brief summary from me of the major changes that are being proposed to the contract procedure rules. As you're aware, the rules govern the way in which the council procures goods, services and works. And so whilst they need to ensure that the procurements are compliant with public contract regulations, they also need to operate in a way which is practical, so that officers and members are supported to make the right procurement decisions. The current rules were updated in May 2021, but a number of internal reviews and internal audits since then have led to several changes becoming necessary. The updated rules that you have before you have been stripped of information which is guidance only. That information has been transferred into a document called the Procurement Guide, that is available on the procurement intranet pages. And the benefit of that is that information can be updated regularly as and when needed. So what remains in the rules are rules which must be followed, and what we hope is that they're more clearly defined and they're therefore more easy to follow. In order to ensure that the rules don't introduce unnecessary red tape or hinder efficient and effective procurement processes, a number of changes have been made since the rules were last updated. The first is that the value at which contracts need to be sealed has been increased from 100,000 to 500,000, and the report summarises the reasons for this increase. It brings the value in line with good practice from other councils, and also helps to ensure the efficient progress of contracts through the award process. The concept of a responsible officer has been introduced to more clearly define the roles and responsibilities of each officer involved in procurement activity at the council. We've introduced a requirement that where the contract is valued over 100,000, the assigned copy of the contract must be sent through to the central procurement team so that we can safely store that copy. And that's to ensure that a copy is always easily available for internal audit and contract management purposes. And that recommendation is as a direct response to an audit recommendation. A further change is that we are proposing that there is no longer a need to seek a waiver where a competition that has been run in compliance with the contract procedure rules results in fewer than 3 bids. And that's because, as you're aware, waivers are there to support where the contract procedure rules haven't been followed. And in this instance, they will have been followed. In order to ensure that procurements are run smoothly and compliantly, there's now a requirement to have a procurement plan signed off at the start of the process and an award report signed off at the end of the process where procurements are valued at more than £100,000. And we're also recommending that the requirement for the monitoring officer to approve contracts valued over 4 years, contracts longer than 4 years is removed because there are other safeguards in place to protect the council where long or high value procurements are being run. For example, the key decision threshold where committee approval is required for the procurement. And you will see that there's also an updated delegated authorities matrix as an appendix to the proposed revised contract procedure rules. So those are the major changes that I wanted to draw your attention to. I'm very happy to take questions.
Thank you for that. Seems very sensible and straightforward. Questions, if any? Councillor Gough.
I'm just curious on the 2.34, the retention of PDF contracts for over 100,000 begs the question as to what happens to contracts less than 100,000. I think. What's the process for that? Is it any different?
Currently, services keep a copy of their own contracts within their own filing system. There is a possibility to upload a copy of the contract to the contract register, but I think internal audits have found that sometimes those are difficult to find, which is why for those higher value contracts, they're now coming through to us.
Councillor Ferguson.
On the same question, signed PDFs, do you mean a physically signed PDF or use some sort of digital signature, or don't you know?
I think at the moment contracts have to be physically signed, but we're happy for a digital version to be sent to us.
Okay, lovely. Any other questions? No questions. So could I please have a proposer for the recommendation? Councillor Boulat, a seconder. Councillor Ferguson, thank you very much. All those in favour? Any against? No abstentions either. Thank you very much indeed for that. That's great. Thank you very much. So we now move on to agenda item number 5, which is arrangements for the appointment of independent persons. Our Democratic Services Manager, Mrs. Rowe, will present the report.
Thank you, Chair. Section 1 of the report outlines the requirement for the authority to have independent persons, and you'll see in that section exactly the type of work that they do. Our current 2 independent persons were appointed by Council in 2019 and come to the end of their 2-year period in October 2022. You'll see from section 2.7 of the report that in 2019 we did actually go out to advertise for independent persons, and I'm afraid we didn't actually manage to attract anybody to that advert. I think the point to raise that there are not lots of people out there necessarily desperate to be an independent person. So that's probably worth bearing that in mind. Although you'll see from the recommendation, the choice is yours. We are proposing that you either consider reappointing our current 2 independent persons or go out to advert. We would then take, on your recommendation, a report to council in May, if necessary, to reappoint the 2 independent persons we currently have. The other issue that I do need to draw your attention to is the current remuneration that the independent persons receive. It's a flat fee currently of £500 per annum. This has been the fee for quite some time and has been reviewed by this committee at regular points. I think I also need to bring to your attention, we've done some research of other authorities, and it's probably worth noting the ones relating to Cambridgeshire. And you'll see that from that research, Cambridge City Council pay £100 per annum. Oh, sorry, £1,000 per annum. East Cambridgeshire pay just over £1,000. South Cambridgeshire pay just over £1,000. And Hunts, I think it's 250 per review with travel and expenses. Unfortunately, we weren't able to get hold of Fenland District Council's rate, and the combined authority pay £1,000 per annum. So as part of your consideration as to what we should do regarding the reappointment, we're also asking you to recommend whether the current fee should be reconsidered.
Thank you, Mrs. Rowe. Questions? Councillor French.
Thank you. Are the 2 independent people prepared to stay on?
Chair, if I may come in on that. Yes, they both are. I've contacted them both and they are.
And question, why did you not manage to get hold of Fenland Council?
We did contact them, but we didn't receive a response, and I wasn't able to find it on their website. It may be there, but I couldn't find it.
Thank you for that. Any other questions on this report? We are asked to do 2 things. The first is to either reappoint Gillian Holmes and Grant Osborne for a period of 2 years until October 2024, or to undertake all necessary steps towards the selection of suitable candidates to be recommended to full council for appointment. And we are also asked to set the level of remuneration. And I think that reading between the lines, it would seem sensible and fair that our independent persons be remunerated in an equivalent form to the districts. And so I would suggest that we change the £500 to £1,000. And I would further suggest that that is linked every year to the national settlement, so that it's not something that need trouble us again for some time. So I'm going to make 2 proposals. The first, that we authorize that reappointment of those 2 individuals. And secondly, the pay remuneration that I've set out. Do I have a seconder? Lots of seconders. So Councillor Boulat, I will take as Vice Chair. Members, are you happy with those? All those in favour? None against, no abstentions. Okay, thank you very much indeed. That is very helpful. We're happy with that, Mrs. Rowe. Thank you very much. Let us move on in that case to agenda item 6, which is Local Government Ethical Standards, Government's Response to the Committee on Standards and Public Life report. And our monitoring officer, Fiona McMillan, is to present this report.
Thank you, Chair, and good afternoon, members. I'm conscious of the fact that many of the committee here today will not have been part of this committee's previous examination of these issues. So I will try to cover the essential points of what's set out in the report, whilst trying not to repeat too much. So the Committee on Standards and Public Life issued a report into the Local Government Ethical Standards back in January 2019, making a number of recommendations to central government, some of which required primary legislation changes to the Localism Act, and others included the introduction of a new model code of conduct drafted by the Local Government Association. The report also made a number of recommendations to local authorities on what it considered to be best practice on various elements of ethical standards. This Committee on Standards and Public Life report was considered by this Constitution and Ethics Committee in April 2019, when members agreed to await the government's response, but also to consider and agree an overhauled gift and hospitality policy, which is now in place. The Committee on Standards and Public Life wrote to all monitoring officers of local authorities in the autumn of 2020, asking us to report back on the Council's progress against their best practice recommendations, which I did. So the government has now published its response, which is attached as Appendix A, emphasising that it's committed to supporting local government ethical standards and willing to build on the enthusiasm from the sector for improvement and to ensure that the system it was robust. It agreed with the move away from a national standards body, for those of you that remember Standards Board for England, to making local authorities responsible for ethical standards, and that had brought benefits, giving councils the flexibility and discretion to resolve matters informally. However, with regard to the recommendations for the legislative changes, the government's view is that many of those could be more appropriately, effectively and swiftly taken forward by councils as best practice rather than changing the law. Of particular interest to you all, no doubt, will be the government's rejection of the recommendation that councils should be able to suspend councillors without allowances for up to 6 months for breaches of the Code of Conduct. The government's response was that notable breaches of the code only happened on rare occasions, and councils did have some sanctions available already under the current regime, including party discipline and ultimate accountability via the ballot box. However, the government also agreed that further work on options for strengthening sanctions needed to take place via engagement with representatives of the various sector bodies, of councillors and officers at all tiers of local government. Views will be sought in due course on options to strengthen sanctions to address breaches of the code, which fall below the criminal activity level in relation to disclosable pecuniary interests, but involve serious incidents of bullying and harassment or disruptive behaviour. And the committee may wish to consider this further so that your views can be fed back into this work, either today or at a later date. I've also set out in the written report the chairman of the Committee on Standards and Public Life, Lord Evans' response to the government's response, where he expressed disappointment that many of its recommendations had not been accepted, despite the sector evidence that had been gathered. But he was glad that many councils had already reviewed their approach following his recommendations and adopted best practice points, stressing the importance of local government having robust arrangements in place in order to have public confidence in our decision-making processes. So the written report sets out each of the recommendations along with the government's responses, and I can go through them, flagging any areas that you may wish to consider as a committee. Chair, I'm just wondering if you'd like to discuss these as I go along after each one or all together at the end.
I think probably we'll go along and members can indicate when they have a question at each particular section. Does that suit? Yep. Thank you.
Thank you. So first of all, the first recommendation was about the Local Government Association creating an updated model code of conduct, which they've done. It was published in January 2021, and this committee considered it in September 2021, reviewing it against its current code. The committee agreed to retain our current code for the time being, but to keep it under review and await the government's response to the report, which we now have. So really the issue for you today is whether we want to go back and relook at the code in relation to the model code, or whether to leave it as it is at the moment, or whether just to pick out little bits of it that you might think could be improved. For instance, we've got a single line on bullying in our code of conduct, and the new model code has quite a substantial section on bullying, which you might feel you might want to revisit in light of the recent standards hearing. So do you want me to go on to the next one, or should we talk about that first?
Comments and views, members? Councillor Coutts.
Why would we not want to adapt our code to that of the Local Government Association?
The view taken at the time was that our current code of conduct actually is quite similar to the new model code. We already had a good code of conduct at the county, but there are some areas that perhaps more emphasis might have been placed on in the new model code that you might want to revisit, or you might want to look at it again in due course. One of the other recommendations actually is that we should review the model code, our own code of conduct, on an annual basis, and that might be something that would be a good thing for us to do.
Thoughts? My suggestion would be that we did, sorry, Councillor Goff, did you want to? My suggestion in that case, given that we reviewed it in September 2021, that perhaps we could review it in September 22, highlighting the differences between the two codes, and then we can adopt them on either a whole scale or piece by piece basis. Is that sensible? I think nods around the head. Thank you. Fiona, if you'd like to continue.
Thank you, Chair. So second recommendation was about disclosing home addresses on when you're standing for election, and the government is taking that forward, and we'll be doing further consultation on that, which is a good thing, I think, in terms of some of the intimidation that local elected members have been facing. So that's a positive. Recommendation 3 is about the Committee on Standards and Public Life wanted to add in a presumption that councillors were acting in their official capacity rather than deciding it on a case by case basis, and that included when you're making statements on publicly accessible social media. So the government's view was that it's up to each authority to decide whether or not the conduct is appropriate in terms of social media. And we have a little bit of a checkered history in looking at this committee. We've started looking at it back after the report was issued by the Committee on Standards and Public Life. The committee agreed to adopt a social media code, then it withdrew from that position, and then it decided to ultimately wait for the government's response. So whether you want to go near it again or not, I don't know. Social media is a tricky subject sometimes. Some members have quite strong views on it, but equally it can be a hotbed for conduct complaints. I have to say, not so much here at the county so far, but I've certainly had to deal with plenty of them elsewhere. So
thoughts on our code of conduct as it relates to social media, which is a hot potato that we've tangled with many times before, as Fiona has set out. My inclination is again to defer this to the September 2022 meeting, and to have a think about it. And who knows, Mr. Musk may have rewritten the whole world by then. Does anybody have any views on that? Happy to do that? Okay, thank you. Mr. French.
Yeah, can I ask what happened to recommendation 2?
I thought I did cover that. It was basically saying the government has accepted that and is going to do further work on it. So it's a good news really for councillors in terms of protecting their home details when they're standing for election.
Unless you want to know where they live.
I can't understand why somebody wants to stand for election and they don't want to give up their address.
That very much depends on what your personal experience might have been of intimidation and harassment at your home address, and certainly in quite a large number of councillors nationally and locally have experienced problems with people in terms of that. Really quite horrific, I have to say.
Recommendation 4, I think.
Thank you. Yes, so this is about amending the Localism Act to state that the code applies to a member when you claim to act or give the impression that you're acting in a capacity as a member. So the government's response was that's no change. I don't see any reason to change the law on that. It's up to each council's code to cover that. And that is covered in our code already. Again, we can pick up on some of these whenever we bring back another report in September. I've made a comment there that I think nearly all councillors have undertaken the standards and governance training. And we ran a session after the elections last year, and there's also a recording available online. So if any members haven't done so, please, I would encourage you to do that.
Okay. Next, please, Fiona.
Thank you. The next one was in relation to adding to the disclosure of pecuniary interests regulations, which set out the things that by law you have to disclose on your register of interests, membership of directorships, trusteeships, management roles in bodies of a public nature and charities, and membership of any organisations that seek to influence opinion and public policy. So the government the response is that they're not going to change the law to insist on that. But obviously, again, it's up to everybody's own code to decide what needs to go on a register, but certainly not by statute.
Noted. Yep.
So the next one is about gifts and hospitality. And the recommendation was that gifts should be declared over a value of £50 or over a total of £100 in a year from a single source. So this was the area that this committee looked at shortly after these recommendations and overhauled the council's gifts and hospitality policy. But the agreement was to set the financial limit at £100, so it is more than is recommended by the government, as that was felt at the time that it would cover the chair of the council acting in their civic capacity. I think Councillor Maguire at the time made some comments about how the lower limit wouldn't allow for that, so it was felt that that was appropriate. And we've strengthened our policy on that, so I don't think that one needs to be revisited at the moment.
I agree. Everybody happy with that? Thank you.
Recommendation 7 is in relation to the Localism Act, section 31, which I'm sure you're all aware of the exact wording on it, but that's in relation to the criminal offence. That is, if you breach the regulations on disclosable pecuniary interest, it is a potential criminal offence. So the Committee on Standards and Public Life felt that we didn't need to have a criminal offence for this area and recommended getting rid of it and replacing it with other things, which we'll come on to in due course. But the government's response was, no, we're going to keep it in place as is. So no change there. So there's not anything we can do about that. The Localism Act is the Localism Act and we have to comply.
No, I think we note that.
Finally, not finally, still quite a few more to go, sorry. Recommendation 8 was about independent persons. We've obviously just had a report on that. The committee felt that it should be a 2-year fixed term renewable only once. The government's view was no, leave it up to local authorities to decide on their local situations, difficult to recruit and so on. And that's what you've decided, to reappoint our current independent members for longer.
Noted. Thank you.
And then recommendation 9, which is about the Local Government Transparency Code, which is about making sure that the views of the independent person are formally recorded in any decision notices, which the government didn't agree with, but we do anyway. So I don't think we need to change that because it's something that we already do as best practice anyway.
Press on. Thank you.
Right, and then recommendations 10, 12, 13, 14 and 16 were grouped together in the government's response, which were all to do, well, first of all, was to do with the ability to suspend a councillor, which there is no provision in the current legislation. The government wanted to make very clear in its response that this was a deliberate policy decision at the time that the Standards Board for England was abolished. It used to be that councillors could be suspended for up to 2 years and disqualified for up to 5 years under the old national regime. That was all got done away with, and they don't want to return to that. They feel that current sanctions, as I've already said, are appropriate. Party political discipline should kick in as much as having any kind of national sanctions for it under the law. And I think, therefore, they're going to do some more work on other sanctions that the councils could use or they might want to bring in. But at the moment, there's not going to be any powers of suspension or disqualification brought back in. Now, there has been quite a lot of comment back on this from in relation to independent members on council, which would not be subject to a party's discipline, not relevant for this council at the moment necessarily. There are, you know, if there's no central national party, political party that can discipline its members, then independent members there may be an issue, and I know there has been at some councils, and also in relation to parish council members. There have been a number of issues not relevant for this council as a county, but the national body for local councils was quite vociferous in its response to this government response, on the basis that it didn't allow decent enough sanctions in relation to parish councillors. So that's just for your information.
Any comments? Okay.
Right, recommendation 11, which is about providing the independent person with a legal indemnity. It's not going to be legislated for. The councils can do it if they wish to. We don't have it at the moment. I don't know whether that's something you might want to consider. At the moment, we don't generally offer access to the independent person to complainants or subject members. So it's not really an issue, I don't think, but
any comment?
Members might have a different
No.
view. No, just leave as is.
Yep.
Right, and then the transparency code was about council's recommendation 15 was about councils publishing an annual list of code of conduct complaints, what it related to, and so on. We used to do that to the Standards Board for England every year. We had to do an annual return. Government believes that it should not be prescriptive, so it's not recommending it. But it's up to councils if they wish to do it. We obviously bring a code of conduct update report to this committee quarterly, so it's already out there. We publish our findings on the website, so I think we're probably as transparent as it can be anyway. But I don't know whether you want to consider doing an annual report to full council. That would be the thing that we don't do.
I don't get a sense of enthusiasm for that. I think the quarterly reports are quite enough.
Prize, Chair. Right, where are we? 20 recommendations 17.
On recommendation 17, it reads, the commentary reads extremely rare, so the government will consider this further. And I just wondered if it was the government will not consider this further.
Let me just check that against the thing. 17. No, it is. That's exactly as is. The occasion where councils would seek to bar councillors from council premises are thought to be extremely rare. Full stop. We will consider this further. So
we may yet be able to bar councillors from the premises.
I don't think that will include barring a councillor from fulfilling their democratically elected role. Like it couldn't. So.
Okay. Thanks. Let's press on then, Fiona. Thank you.
Yes. Right. And then recommendation 18 was about the criminal offences being abolished in the Localism Act again. That's not considered to be necessary. And they feel that getting the police involved in these complaints discourages any politically motivated and unfounded complaints.
Any thoughts? No.
And then the next couple are in relation to parish councillors, which don't affect this council, so I shall skip on. And then the recommendation 22 is in relation to adding to the protections offered to the 3 statutory officers, which I suppose I should declare an interest in.
Any comment? No, thank you.
And then recommendation 23 is about the local government transparency code and making sure that the whistleblowing policy has got a named contact for the external auditor, and that's all in our whistleblowing policy, which is at that link in the report. And then finally, you'll be glad to hear recommendation 24 about councillors being listed as prescribed persons in relation to the Public Interest Disclosure Act. And they are going to look at that further, not in relation to that, but just how it can be strengthened in that area.
Thank you very much for that. Very comprehensive. So we are asked to identify any future actions or further reports following the government's response to the recommendations. There's not been enormous feedback on all of those government responses, other than in my own mind, I think an awful lot of work went into the government then to come back and say no, pretty much to all of them. Anybody got anything else they want to add? No, I think that, and that's from our perspective, that's where it stops.
Well, you indicated that you wish me to bring a report back to September, yes, and to have an annual report.
Yeah.
Annual review of the code of conduct. So I think.
Okay, everybody happy with that? So that being the case, thank you very much indeed for that. I do appreciate how much work went into that. We move next to item number 7, which is the scheme of delegation, and our Democratic Services Manager, Mrs. Rowe, to present the report.
Thank you, Chair. Hopefully this one will be quite quick. Constitutionally, we're required annually to take to the annual meeting of Council a recommendation that Council agree the scheme of delegation or such part of it as the Constitution determines it is for Council to agree. And so I'm asking for this committee to recommend that we take a report to Council to do just that.
Nice and brisk. Any comments? Right, do I have a proposer for that? Councillor Boulat, seconder, Councillor French, all in favour? Any against? No, no abstentions. Super, thank you very much, Mrs. Rowe, that is splendid. The next item is our agenda plan, which is starkly barren. Does anybody have anything that they wish to raise on this? Obviously, if there is no business, we won't have a meeting. If there is business, we will have a meeting.
To add in for a September meeting, what the things you've just discussed.
Indeed.
Yes.
However, currently for June, you may have an opportunity to go on holiday. No, when the report deadline is the 3rd of June. So I think we'll probably come to a decision well before that. Okay, members, thank you very much. That being all the business on the agenda, that concludes our meeting. Thank you very much for coming along, and safe journey home. Thank you.